What is plagiarism? Since it is important to determine what constitutes misconduct in scientific writing, and plagiarism is a much used concept in discussion of scientific misconduct, one could perhaps expect agreement and fairly high level of precision regarding what constitutes plagiarism. However, while there is there is agreement about paradigmatic cases of plagiarism, there is less agreement regarding how plagiarism should be defined. In fact, the issue is rarely discussed in detail. When the concept is explained in recent newsletter from the US Office of Research Integrity, it looks deceptively simple. It involves stealing someone else's works and lying about it afterward. Others prefer to speak of copying part of someone else's published work and using it without showing that is borrowed from someone else. In the Longman Contemporary English Advanced Learning Dictionary, the act of plagiarism is defined as when someone uses another person's words, ideas, or work and pretend they are their own. In the scholarly definition, the more technical notion of appropriation and the credits are central. Plagiarism is the appropriation of other people's material without giving proper credit. Plagiarism is the appropriation of another person's idea, process, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. So the basic idea seems to be that someone deliberately takes someone else's work, whether in the form of an idea, a method, data, result, or text, and present it as their own, instead of giving credit to the person whose idea, result, or word it is. This is mirrored in the definition given by Merriam-Webster to steal and pass off, which means the idea or words of another as someone's own use, another production, without crediting it the source. Plagiarism has two components. Common to, the, Common to these definitions is that plagiarism is composed of two parts: to appropriate the work of someone else, and second, passing it as off as one's own by not giving proper credit. Let us first look what it means to appropriate someone else's work. In some definition, plagiarism is characterized as stealing. However, if plagiarism is definition concerns stealing, that it is not theft in the traditional sense of taking a thing, where if a person A takes it from person B, then B will no longer have it. What is appropriated in such instance of plagiarism is intellectual property, which means ideas, as when people download copyright protected films or music from the internet. Thus, the extent of that plagiarism is theft. It is stealing someone else's intellectual work by copying it. Related to the research paper, it is about copying another text, table, graphs, or pictures into one's own paper without having permission to do so. We are, however, disinclined to include stealing in our definition, although one may steal intellectual as well as non-intellectual property and even talk about theft of the recognitions due to the original contributor. Talking about plagiarism as stealing is nevertheless misguided, at least as part of the definition. This is so because using someone else's text, say, and passing it off as one's own can be done regardless of whether one steals the text or not. One can do it by finding the text in a journal, book, or by using an unpublished paper, or by stealing it from someone else's computer or drawer. Thus, it seems that stealing is not constitute part does not it does it seems that stealing is not constituting part of plagiarism. In fact, if you plagiarize a text, even if it was willingly handed to you by research acquaintance, if you use it, it implies that it was you who created it. However, plagiarism does not preclude that the text presented as one's own has been literally stolen from someone else. You may steal a manuscript in order to plagiarize it, just as you may steal it in order to keep it without showing it to anyone. If you do that, if you do that means that you pass off the stolen manuscript as your own. It may still be argued that there is a sense of stealing that concerns appropriating someone else's intellectual work and passing it off as one's own. In this sense, you may steal someone's song if you play it and claim to have composed it yourself. This seems to mean that there is a sense of stealing that is equivalent to plagiarizing. If so, the second understanding of stealing, which is distinct from the ones discussed above, cannot contribute anything to a definition of plagiarism. The conclusion remains: stealing or theft cannot be used as part of the definition of plagiarism. To appropriate does not have to imply stealing. It could also mean, for instance, acquire, borrow, take, or expropriate. We nevertheless suggest that appropriate should be avoided just because it is such an ambiguous term and therefore would introduce obscurity in the definition. We instead suggest that use is employed. It seems then that it is the second part of the definition that will distinguish cases of plagiarism from acceptable cases of using the result of another's intellectual effort. The second alleged aspect or component of plagiarism is passing it off as one's own. This can be done with or without the approval of the person or persons being plagiarized. So it is not about whether or not the reuse that has the author's approval, but about what impression is given by that use. Using someone else's work and being dishonest or otherwise misleading about where it comes from seems to be what makes the act an act of plagiarism, but dishonest or misleading in a special way. If person A uses passage from a text by person B but claims that it was written by C, then even though it is an incorrect claim, it is not plagiarism, but simply incorrect referring. If intentional, it is kind of fraudulent behavior. It is when A claims to have written the passage him or herself that it becomes plagiarism. This was brought out in the definition proven by Merriam-Webster above. It is when we pass something off as our own, although it isn't, that we plagiarize. This seems to be the core of plagiarism. An intellectual product of one's own. It is not accident that plagiarism is discussed in relation to research, although it is also clearly relevant in relation to music, literature, art, and design, since it relates to using the product of someone else's intellectual work while passing it off as one's own. Note that there is no reason to restrict the use of the term to published work, since you may use someone else's work while passing it off as your own even if it is not published. For instance, you may do it by first stealing the manuscript from the author, by using passages from an unpublished manuscript circulated at a seminar, or by using ideas communicated at a lecture. What if a person does not go to the trouble of writing up a paper in which the results of others' intellectual efforts are used? With the pretense of being the person's own, what if the person simply makes the wrongful claim that this is my work? Would that also be plagiarism? Example, a scientific paper as astrophysics is published in a renowned journal by a group of researchers. Researcher Yonton, not a part of the group, then goes public falsely claiming that the published results are hers. Would she thereby be plagiarizing? Our explanation so far leans toward the view that plagiarism concerns a product of one's own containing the appropriation of the intellectual work of someone else. We believe that it would be constructive to claim that plagiarism consists not only in passing someone else's work or intellectual product off as one's own, but also in using it as a product of one's own. going for this position, falsely claiming a work of another to be one's own would not be plagiarism, but would count as a false accusation of plagiarism and theft. Our definition to plagiarize, to to plagiarize would thus at this stage be to use someone else's intellectual product while passing it off as one's own, where use is meant to indicate that it is made part or the whole of a product of one's own. However, although quite a few attempts at a definition of plagiarism include elements such as lying or pretending it is one's own intellectual work, others rather describe the second part of the definition in terms of not giving the proper or appropriate credit, while the first set of expressions, stealing, lying, and pretending implies intentions. The second set is neutral in this regard, while ordinary language use of plagiarism certainly allows for the act of plagiarizing being unintentional. It seems as clear that plagiarism does not necessarily involve an intention to deceive. We therefore would like to suggest a definition that does not require intention. The notion of passing someone passing something off also seems to imply intention and therefore ought preferably to be avoided. A slightly modified definition where we define plagiarism rather than to plagiarize would therefore read plagiarism an instant of someone using someone else's work, thereby implying that it is their own. Plagiarizing ideas, plagiarizing work. What then? Count as an intellectual product. The standard case of plagiarism is the use of someone else's text. We have seen that Merriam-Webster mentioned word or ideas, while Longman talks of words, ideas, or works. It is reasonable to say that ideas can be plagiarized. And what about work? Let us look at it first. It seems that one can talk about plagiarizing ideas just as well as one can talk about plagiarizing research or text. Since ideas are obvious example of research results of intellectual work, if someone uses another's idea and implies that it is an idea of their own, that someone is plagiarizing. True, it must be admitted that it may often be much more difficult to verify that an idea has been plagiarized. Compared to research result or text, ideas are not always documented, but might be presented at conferences or in a personal conversation, etc. The difficulty pertains both to finding out about plagiarism and to making a convincing case for idea plagiarism to have taken place. There is no clear software to discern this, not if easily proven that an idea is not independently arrived at. These difficulties are, however, practical. They do not change the fact that ideas can be plagiarized. Some might be reluctant on ideological ground to accept that ideas can be plagiarized. They might think that ideas should be free and not be the intellectual property of anyone. However, our position is agnostic on this ideological debate, since the definition does not rely on notions of stealing intellectual property. Freedom of ideas is compatible with the view that you are plagiarizing if you use someone else's idea while implying that it is your own. What then about plagiarizing work? As previously noted, plagiarism is related to work must concern intellectual work. In this context, the term work has two distinct senses: a product based on intellectual labor, or that labor itself. When someone is plagiarizing a text presenting research results, thereby implying that they are presenting their own result, then that person also implies that they have done the work. leading up to the result. In that sense, you can say that a person is also plagiarizing the work put into it. By plagiarizing someone's ideas, you, by the same token, make implicit claims about the work leading up to that idea. But it is hard to see that it makes sense to talk about plagiarizing work, labor, directly. Let us look at an example. Say that Mr. A visited Mr. B and sees a beautiful chair that Mr. B has made to her own design. Mr. A goes home with the identical chair and claims when friends ask that it is of his own design. When it comes to the chair, it is clear that it is the idea of making the chair just like that, i.e., the design, and not the work of making the chair, which he in fact did. That is plagiarized. Plagiarizing work means plagiarizing ideas relating to how to do the work, the result of work, or the documentation of how the work was performed, not the labor itself. The latter would be to repeat the work, not to plagiarize it. We therefore choose not to talk about work, but instead of an intellectual product being plagiarized. So our definition will be the following: plagiarism, an instance of someone's using someone else's intellectual product, such as text, ideas, or results, thereby implying that it is their own. The normative status of plagiarism. It is part of parcels of good research practice to know the difference between plagiarism and established rules for citations and quotation, but judging the normative status of different cases of plagiarism in other issues. While some constitute major cases of misconduct, others may be considered minor deviation from good research practice. While copying half a research article into one's own paper would be serious misconduct, copying 5 to 10 average length and spread out sentences of limited importance in a 5-page paper is perhaps not. Yet another issue is what policies are reasonable to adopt at universities and research institutes. Before discussing what makes some form of plagiarism worse than others, we should say something about what makes plagiarism bad to begin with. Plagiarism is one of the core instances of research misconduct, the other two being fabrication and falsification. Fabrication concerns making up research results instead of actually producing them by doing research. Falsification concerns tampering with research results, research methods, or data analysis. Common to both is that the researchers are misleading about what they have accomplished. They pretend to have done the research, to have reached the presented result, to have used the correct method and procedures, or to have implied appropriation analysis in the way described. Fabrication and falsification are directly terminal to science, with the indirect effect that researchers may prosper from publication based on this kind of fraud. Plagiarism is commonly held to be reprehensible because it makes publications misleading regarding who deserves credit for the intellectual work done. Thus, it is unjust. It is also common to refer to the very act itself, declaring it to be an instance of cheating and betraying both reprehensible acts. Some also point to the person plagiarizing, maintaining that an additional wrongness of plagiarism lies in the fact that it makes the person a cheat and an impostor. These remarks, however, are restricted to intentional plagiarism. Plagiarism may further have unjust consequences by affecting who gets good grades, academic positions, and research funding. In addition, plagiarism of data or result distorts the scientific record by giving a misleading account of research accomplishment. What is presented as new collections of data or as new result is not. Instead, it is a reiteration of what has already been done. Thereby, It is also distorts meta-analysis. Let us now ask what aspects affect the normative status of a case of plagiarism. There is no direct connection between what aspects are relevant to determine whether or not something is plagiarism and what aspects are relevant to a specific normative judgment of an instance of plagiarism. For instance, aspects that are relevant when determined whether or not something is plagiarism may have nothing to add when it comes to evaluating gravity, as might sometimes be the case when regarding the originality or ordinariness of passages, appropriation in material of one's own. Other aspects are irrelevant when determining whether or not it is a case of plagiarism, but may be relevant when determining the seriousness of the plagiarism, such as whether or not the plagiarism was intended or the scientific merit value of the publication or representation containing plagiarism. So, what aspects affect the normative status of a case of plagiarism? Candidate includes the value of that which is appropriated, the manner in which plagiarism is performed, the degree of harm to the plagiarized person, the degree of personal gain to the offender, whether the plagiarism is intentional or not. Before going any further, we should first note that one may distinguish between what makes plagiarism worse, what makes an action involving plagiarism worse on the whole. The first one, between what makes plagiarism worse, it is roughly point A and point 2. What makes an action involving plagiarism worse on the whole, it is the point 3 and point 4. And what makes the plagiarized more or less blameworthy, it is point 5. Now we move to copyright and the risk of getting reported. Even if the use of claiming key passages by recognized authorities without following established regional referencing practice is recognized as good research practice in a certain context, there are two circumstances that argue strongly for a caution approach to such practice. They both point out that the suggested practice only works as long as you do not get exposed to the wider research society practicing it. First, to reuse, for instance, a widely known methods section might not fool anyone in the field about its origin, but it might still be wronging the publishing house involved. The copyright is in the original text is likely to be owned by someone, and if someone else uses text without proper referencing, then that person will be infringing the copyright. Also, the publisher of the text will expect all material to be original unless the contrary is explicitly stated or shown. If the author or authors are not open about it, the publisher will be deceived. Second, to have sections imported from another source without proper references and quotations is to invite accusation of research misconducts from those who spot the practice and are willingly to cause harm to those doing it. We thus advise against this practice on this ground. To conclude, we suggest that plagiarism should be understood as using someone else's intellectual product, such as text, ideas, or results, thereby implying that it is their own. This may be done intentionally or unintentionally. This fits the use of the term in ordinary language fairly well, while at the same time being sufficiently precise. Arguably, it is reliable by being simple and easily comprehensible. We suggest that our discussion support the view that the definition of is theoretically fruitful and highly relevant for normative purposes. As a result of our normative analysis, we suggest that what makes plagiarism reprehensible is that it involves an unfair acquisition of scientific credit. In addition, intentional plagiarism involves dishonesty in plagiarism of data or result fabrication is also implied.